Hello, today I wanted to go over a problem that you encounter in finite mathematics. It's a simplex method problem, and I want to go through the problem in its entirety. Now just remember, there are going to be parts of the process that I cut out where I'm entering stuff in my calculator or I'm doing operations in my calculator, but just be aware you can always pause the video anywhere you need to keep up or to go back, and if you're following along, do it yourself. So just be aware of that. If you do need to pause, feel free to. But let's get started. This is the original problem right here. It's about a guy who's doing an exercise program, and he's doing swimming, jogging, and bicycling. It says that first sentence he would like to exercise at most 28 hours. And if you look right there, right above where the answers are, it says that X1 needs to be the hours bicycling, X2 is the hours spent jogging, and X3 is your number of hours spent swimming. If you want to set up an inequality for the at most 28 hours, set it as X1 plus X2 plus X3 is less than or equal to 28. The next part of the problem says that he wants to devote at most 3 hours to swimming. So basically here I want to set up an inequality that has x3 and the number 3. Well, x3 is less than or equal to 3 is the at most that we want there. The next part of the problem says he wants to jog for no more than the total number of hours bicycling and swimming. We want to set up an inequality for jogging here, and we know that jogging needs to be less than or equal to the number of hours that is bicycling, x1, plus the number of hours swimming, x3. So just make sure your x1 plus your x3 is on the greater side of the inequality, and then your number of jogging is on the lower side. And if you notice at the very end of the problem, it has a hint that says to write the constraint involving jogging in the form of less than or equal to 0. So what we need to do is we need to move the x1 and x3 over onto the left side of the inequality and make it look like this right here for when we plug it into our simplex matrix. The last sentence says that the calories burned by this person per hour from doing the activities are 200, 520, and 590 respectively. So bicycling needs to be first, and this is your objective function because it says how many hours should be allotted for each activity to maximize the calories burnt. So this is your objective function, and you can see right there they want you to enter in those values for the objective function. So that part of the problem is pretty easy, just putting in those numbers, the values that they want you to enter for each of the activities, calories burned wise. Now that I have all of my inequalities written, I want to actually go ahead and transfer into each one of them the slack variables, have those written down, because I eventually want to set each one of these inequalities up so that I can put them into my calculator. So now what I'm going to do is just rewrite each of these with the slack variables so you can see what they are. And feel free to pause at this point if you need to insert those yourself. This is what your inequalities will look like once you have your slack variables inserted. Now that you have all your slack variables in, this is what your 3 inequalities will look like once you have all of those in. You'll put a S1 in your first inequality. S2, I put that into my second inequality where at most 3 hours swimming, I put S2 there. And then I also put 0x1, 0x2 in, mostly just so that when I put it in my calculator, I'll have those placeholders. And then of course, the rewritten equation involving jogging or whatever. And then the objective function, you can see right now, I'm going ahead and writing that down, solved for 0 kind of, where you have negative 200x1, negative 520x2, and negative 290x3. I know that I'll have to put that into my calculator as well. So at this point, really, you're ready to set up all your variables into your calculator, put it into some matrix, and this will get you started on solving it using the simplex method, because we do want to do all of our row operations using the calculator's row plus feature. So this is your initial simplex matrix, all the values that go in there. If you write your simplex matrix out, by the way, this is exactly what it will look like in the calculator. So just so you know what I'm going to be entering in the calculator, I wrote it out with all the variables labeled at the top. And of course, you have those little lines. Those don't appear on the calculator, the little red dotted lines, but they're there with the initial table. And then I want to put all these values into the calculator. So that's where I'm going to go to now. Like I said, feel free to stop the video at any point if you do need more time on entering values or making your matrix, whatever you need to write down so that you can do the problem. Now we want to go to the calculator and start the simplex method. By the way, in the notes, we have the steps for doing the simplex method. And if you're following along with that, we're now at step 4 with setting up the initial table. So just keep in mind, that's where we want to go to. We want to use these steps to solve and finish the problem. So on my calculator, I go ahead and go to second and then matrix. And then I want to go to edit and edit the matrix. This one right here is a 4 by 8 matrix. So I'll go ahead and when I'm in the edit mode of matrix, I'll go ahead and start putting in my top row, which are the 1, 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, and then the 28. That'll be my top row right there. And then the second row of my matrix is 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 0, 3. I'll enter that on the second row of my matrix in my calculator. And then my next row after that will be the negative 1, 1, negative 1, 0, 0, 1, 0, and then 0. And then the last row will end up being my negative 200, my negative 520, my negative 920, and then 0, 0, 0, 1, and then 0. And then after you get this entered into your calculator, you are now prepared to start row 5 or step 5, which is basically trying to locate the most negative indicator on the very bottom row. So now we're ready to start step 5, and we can see that the most negative indicator is going to be the negative 520. So we know that the pivot is going to be in this column. So now you can do step 6 where you do the quotients to figure out what the pivot is. The first quotient will be your 28. You go to the far side with the constants and then divide it by the number in the column. So 28 divided by 1 will be 28. I wrote 1 down. Should be 28, not 1. And then the next will be 3 divided by 0, which you can't divide by 0, so that's undefined. That doesn't really give you any information that you can use, really, honestly, right there. So you just mark through that. And then your other indicator is going to be 0 divided by 1. So, or the other quotient, sorry, will be 0 divided by 1. So this will be the last quotient that you form. Of course, 0 divided by anything is going to be 0. Now, there's something I want to do here. Going back to the steps, it does have a part of the steps that says that you can disregard quotients with 0. If you look there in step 6, disregard. This right here is wrong, and I just want to make a comment on this. If you follow this and use the 1 that's in the top with the 28 divided by 1 is 28. If you let that be what you pivot from, you end up getting a wrong matrix when you start pivoting, or the method is not the right way. So one comment I want to make here is that when you divide by a positive number, 0 divided by a positive number, that's going to end up being okay. Like 0 divided by positive 1 is good. But if you divide by negative 1, that is going to be bad. So that's the only kind of comment that I want to make there on that part of the steps to solving the simplex matrix. And so what we really want to pivot from is that 1 right there on the third row. That's where our pivot is going to be, that number 1. We want everything to become 0 above and below that number. So going back to the calculator, I now want to do row operations to clear out those numbers above the 1 that I'm pivoting from. So you're doing the star row plus operation in your calculator, and I'll show you how to get to that in a second. But I basically want to clear out the top row now, that 1 that's above the 1 in row 1. So I have my matrix A that I'm pivoting from. I want to multiply by negative 1, by the way. So multiply row 3 by negative 1, and then you put in the row you're multiplying 3. That's the pivot row right there, number 3. And then the row that you're wanting to change, that's the number that goes in the very end of star row plus right there. So that's what you want to have on your calculator screen when you want to change that first row right there. So go into your calculator. You want to hit the following sequence of buttons, second, and then matrix. And if you go to the math menu, you'll see star row plus at the very bottom. So you'll put in the -1. That's what you're multiplying by. You'll put in your matrix, which you have to call forth the matrix, put it in. And then, of course, comma, you do your row you're pivoting from. So the row you're multiplying that -1 by, and then the row you're wanting to change is the top row. And I always double check to see that I have a 0 right there before I go to the next step. So now I want to change that -520 at the bottom. I want that to be a 0 as well below the 1. So I'll have to do a star row plus operation for that. I want to multiply the 1 by positive 520 so I can get rid of that -520. And then you don't have to, since the matrix is already in your calculator from what you just did, just use the ANS key on your calculator, and then you want to pivot from row 3, change row 4. So you'll have star row plus from the math menu of matrix, and then you'll put in your 520, and the way you get to the answer key, do your comma, second, and the negative sign will give you answer, your previous answer, which is that big massive matrix. You want to pivot from row 3, change row 4, and then always just double check, make sure that you have a 0 there so you can, verify it. Okay. Now I'm looking at my matrix, and I see that I still have negatives in the very, very bottom row, and the step 7 says, if you don't have any more negatives, you are done. But we have a few negatives, so we're actually going to have to go back to step 5, is what they say, and then locate the most negative indicator there, pivot, find your pivot again, and then do that whole process we just did over again. Now, I usually don't write anything on my paper from this point forward. I actually keep it all in my calculator. So just make a note where the negative is, and then I would save this matrix into a different matrix, the one that's right here. So I'm going to store this into matrix B, just in case I made any kind of errors along the way. I don't want to have to enter matrices all over again. So I'm going to actually store this matrix that I just got into B. So I hit the STO button, store, and then I pick matrix B. And then now I have this matrix stored there, ready to pivot to get that, that 810 row. We're pivoting in the column that has -810 to try to get zeros in that column now. Now what I want to do is go to my calculator and do step 5. But of course I need to figure out what number is going to be my pivot. I have 28, 3, and 0 on the right side of the constants. So let's look at our quotients and see what's going on here. The first row will be 28 divided by 2. So that gives me a 14 as my quotient for that. The next column will be the 3 divided by the 1. So 3 divided by 1 will be 3. And then my third number above the -810 is going to be 0 divided by -1. And if you remember, this is going to be a 0, but it's the bad 0. It's the one where you're dividing by a negative. So that 0 you will not pivot from. You can't pivot from. So the lowest number is going to be 3 of the quotients. And so that means I'm going to pivot from that 1 that's right there on my problem. Okay? And then I go and make my star row plus operations. I'm going to clear out row 1 first. So I'll multiply by -2 in my matrix B. And then, of course, I want to pivot from row 2, change row 1. And then I'm going to do my star row operation for the third row. So I want to multiply by +1 there, actually, +1. And then I'm going to do that to matrix B, of course, that I've saved. Or actually, my answer, because you want to change it as you go. So you're going to do one after the other. And then you're doing from row 2. You pivot row 2, change row 3. The last one, you want to change row 4 with this one. So you need that 810 to become a 0, the bottom row 810. So I need my ENS, my previous answer. And I want to pivot from row 2, change row 4. And then, of course, I want to store this, whatever I get after that third row operation. I want to store it to matrix, maybe C on this one. So, just in case I make some kind of mistake, something goes bad, I'm just going to store it to different matrices along the way. Now you can see me quickly go ahead and do those row operations with my calculator. So I'm going to do the 3 row operations that I have written down already. Go through and change that first row, get rid of that, and you can see it becomes a 0. Go ahead and change my third row now. So I want that one to be, instead of -1, become 0. So I'll change the third row. And of course the -8, 10, I want that to also go to 0 as well. So I'm going to change that row with my row operation, 8, 10. Of course the previous answer. And then row 2 is where I'm pivoting from. Row 4 is what I want to change. So I'll put all 3 operations in. Now I can see I have zeros in all the places above and below the 1. I'm going to go ahead and save this matrix to C. And now I can look at it right here. And I'm seeing that I have a negative still on the very bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to step 5 and start the process all over again. Now after step 5 of Simplex, it's step 6 where you do the quotients. I have 22, 3, and 3 on the very end. So 22, I'm going to look at that first quotient, which is 22 divided by 2. That'll end up giving me 11 for that quotient, okay, which is okay. It's a positive number. I'm going to do 3 divided by 0, which that's undefined. So, you can't really do anything with that. There's no way you can divide by 0. And then the last one will be 3 divided by -1. Step 6 says you ignore negative numbers, and that's still true. You always ignore negatives. So the only really number we have to pivot from is that 2 right there in the first row. So we want to pivot from that and make zeros appear below it in row 3 and row 4 specifically. So I'm going to do star row plus. My first one, I want that -1 to become 0, so I'm going to do 1/2 times that first row. So remember, you just take whatever number you're going to make 0 and divide it by your pivot number, and that'll be what you multiply by. So I'll take matrix C, and then I want to pivot from row 1, change row 3. Then the next operation will be star row plus. I'm going to do row 4, so do 720 divided by 2, and that'll basically make that row become a 0. Of course, it's pivot from row 1, change row 4, and then I'm going to store that whenever I get done. I'm going to store that into matrix D, just in case I made some kind of mistake, some kind of error. I want to have a place where I'm storing that for the future. Okay, now I want to go ahead and do those row operations that I wrote down. So I'll do my row plus operations. Let's get that row 3 to be a 0 below the 2. So I'll do 1/2 of, and then I'll do my matrix C. I want to pivot from row 1, change row 3. Then I'll do my star row plus operation here to change the -720 to 0. So 720 divided by 0, and then I want to do my previous answer, second negative sign here, and then row 2 or 1 is where I'm pivoting from. Change row 4, and that'll be what I have right there. And now I have my final matrix. I don't have any negatives in the bottom row, so this is the final answer, the maximum form. You can get the maximum from this matrix. So read column 1. I have zeros all below a 2, so I know that's going to be one of the answers kind of right there. 2x1, if we wrote that into an equation. Then you got to look on the very far side to see what number goes with that first one. So it's a 22 that goes with it. It's 22, 3, and 14. So if we can try to remember those 3 numbers. But anyway, when you divide by 2, that'll be 11. So we know that x1 is going to end up being 11 right there. And then if you look in the second column, you have zeros around a 1. There's only one number in there. So we're going to have that be an equation. That'll be the x2 column. So 1x2 equals 14 was the number on the far side for the third row. So we got 2 answers right there. That'll be our bicycling and jogging answers. And then the third column has a 1 and zeros all around it. So it's also going to be an equation. And I'm just going to verify that is 3. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to have 3 hours for swimming, actually. So we can now enter in, finally, after all this work, almost 20 minutes of work, we can finally enter in all of our answers here and see if we're right. Yes. And that's how you know you did it right. So, yeah, good luck. Oh, and I almost forgot the last part of the question. Now it says, what's the maximum number of calories? That's on your calculator too. It's going to be that very bottom number. If you write Z into an equation, I think it was 10350. Is that right? Yeah, 10350. That'll be your maximum number of calories burned.